Welcome back. Today we're going to be reading through chapter 4 in our novel Night of the Spadefoot Toads. Let's get started. The next day after school, Ben checks on the frog in the bucket. It's still just sitting there, and it doesn't seem to be very happy. It doesn't seem very much of anything. He feels bad. He knows that he should let it go, but he doesn't want to yet. He takes a plastic grocery bag and a garden trowel into the backyard where he digs up some dirt and grass and wet leaves. Next, he wanders out under the big trees and finds some worms under the old log. He plops them into the bag and then takes his bag back to the garage and puts the things he's gathered into the bucket with the frog. It's not much of a home, he thinks, but it'll have to do for now. The next morning, a few minutes before time to leave for the bus stop, Ben goes out into the garage to check on the frog. It doesn't seem to have moved since the night before. He feels bad leaving it there all day, so he picks it up and slips it in his jacket again. It'll be fun having a secret frog in his pocket. By the time he gets to school, he wonders, what was he thinking? Was he nuts? What do you do with a frog at school? Ben doesn't want to be there. Why would a frog want to be there either? And he's afraid to leave the jacket hanging on the peg in the coat room, so he keeps it on. Mrs. Kutcher asks him to take it off, but Ben tells her he's cold. And all through the morning, he keeps checking his pocket, and the frog just sits there, barely moving. Once Ben put his hand in his pocket, the frog squirms a little, like it's trying to get away. "It's okay, buddy," he whispers. "At least it's warm in there." Today, Mrs. Kutcher leads the class down to science class. Mrs. Tibbetts isn't in the classroom again, but there's a note on the door saying she's working with the first graders on the other side of the school. Mrs. Kutcher looks at the note and says, "All right, class, you're all fifth graders and know how to behave yourself. Have a seat until Mrs. Tibbetts is back." Everyone takes their seats. Mrs. Kutcher watches them for a moment and then turns and walks down the hall. The class is alone again. Everyone sits at their desk quietly for about 30 seconds. And then they all start talking. Ben checks his pocket again. Ryan notices. "What are you doing?" It's too good of a secret to keep. Ben wants to share it with someone, even if it's only Ryan. So he pulls out the frog. And as soon as he does, he realizes that it was a mistake. Nothing stays a secret with Ryan for long. The kid leaps up from his desk and hops over to Ben's on one foot. "Cool, a frog! Where'd you get it?" "Shh!" Ben tries to calm Ryan down. "I found it behind my house." "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know. Just keep it, I guess." "Well, why don't you scare somebody with it?" Ryan asks. "Or put it down someone's back? Here, let me hold it." Ryan reaches for it, just like he did with the mouse. "I've got to put it back," Ben says. But Ryan already has his fingers on the frog. "Ryan, no!" Ryan's not listening. He can't listen. It's exactly like what happened the other day. What is wrong with this kid? Other kids gather around to see what's going on. Ben pulls the frog away from Ryan, but it wriggles out of his hand and it falls to the floor and sits there. Frankie pounces. Got it, he yells. He holds it up and starts to run around the room with it. He shoves it in Janice Decker's face. Here, kiss it. Give the toady a little kiss. Stop it, she squeals. Come on, Frankie. Give it back, Ben pleads. It's not yours, and it doesn't like it. Poor Toady doesn't like kissing girls. Frankie turns so Ben can't reach the frog and laughs hysterically. What's going on now? Mrs. Tibbet's voice rings out. Everybody stops what they are doing and looks at her, standing in the doorway. In your seats, right this minute. Kids scramble to their desks. Ben doesn't move. He wants the frog back, but is afraid to go after it. It's dead quiet. Mrs. Tibbets walks in the room and slams a stack of books down on her desk. I expect you to act like ladies and gentlemen when I am out of this room, she says. I have to walk all the way across the school to get back to you. Surely you can wait quietly for a minute. Then she notices Ben standing there. He isn't sure what to do. Frankie's in his seat, trying to look innocent. Ben, Mrs. Tibbets says, that means you too. I know, but, Ben starts. But what? In your seat right now. There's nothing for Ben to do but head to his seat. He glances at Frankie, who's still holding on to the frog. But Frankie isn't laughing now. In fact, his mouth is twisted into a scowl and his face is turning red. Everyone knows that Frankie has the frog. Everyone but the teacher. Mrs. Tibbets turns to the whiteboard and starts to write on it. The room is quiet for all of about 10 seconds. Oh, gross, Frankie yells, leaping from his chair. It pooped on me! He drops the frog to the floor and holds his hands out like they have toxic waste on them. Everyone shrieks and laughs. He pooped! He pooped! Ryan squeals, and he's up out of his seat dancing around. Mrs. Tibbets whirls around and glares at the class like they've all lost their minds. What in heaven's name? It pooped on my hands, Frankie moans. Then she sees the frog. It's just sitting there like it belonged in science class. She walks over and looks down at it. The classroom is dead quiet now. Someone's going to die, Mrs. Ben thinks, and it'll probably be me. Frankie, Mrs. Tibbet said, did you bring this into class? She hasn't moved from where she's standing. No, Frankie says. His face is still red. He did, he said, pointing at Ben. He brought it into class and let it go, and I caught it so it wouldn't get hurt. Ben feels sick to his stomach. He knows he's in hot water, but he's more worried about the frog. He never should have brought it to school. He's about to go and grab the creature and is ready to take whatever punishment he gets. But Mrs. Tibbets bends over and grasps the frog at the hips. The frog kicks its legs, and every single kid looks at Mrs. Tibbets in wonder. She cups it in her hand and strokes it underneath its chin. "Ew," someone says. Mrs. Tibbets looks around the class, and a mischievous smile spreads across her face. She kisses the frog. "Ew, gross!" Everyone is yelling now, horrified and delighted. When the class finally calms down, Mrs. Tibbets asks, "Who knows what this is?" "A toad," said Frankie. "Duh." Mrs. Tibbets doesn't say anything. "No, it's not," says Ben. Mrs. Tibbets looks at him quickly. "What is that, Ben?" "It's a frog," he said. "Frog, toad, what's the difference?" Frankie mutters. "It pooped on my hands." Mrs. Tibbets ignores him. She walks toward Ben's desk. "And how do you know it's a frog and not a toad?" "Well, by its color and its skin," Ben said. "What about its skin?" "Well, it's smooth, and toads have bumpy skin, and its legs are longer than a toad's, I think. And toads have these bumps right behind their ears that make this poison stuff." "Parotid glands," Mrs. Tibbets said. "I guess," Ben said. Mrs. Tibbets nods. "You're right. It's a frog. Toads are a kind of frog, but they have certain characteristics that make them special, like you said. So all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads." "Do you know what kind of frog this is?" Ben shakes his head. "One that poops," Ryan says. Mrs. Tibbets doesn't bat an eye. "All frogs poop. All living things poop. Pooping is a part of living." The kids all laugh. Mrs. Tibbets waits until the giggling dies down, and then she says, "This is a wood frog, and a very confused one, too. She's just come out hoping to find a place to lay eggs, and instead she's in science class." Mrs. Tibbets holds the frog up to her face and looks at it closely. Is she going to kiss it again? "They have a funny call," she goes on. "They sound like ducks quacking." "You mean it doesn't chirp or peep?" Ben asks. He's thinking about the sounds behind his house now, and he's forgotten all about being in trouble. "No, those are spring peepers." She looks at Ben with a wry smile on her face, like she can't decide if she should frown or smile. In that moment, Ben feels like she's looking right inside of him. "This frog is not very happy here," she says. And then she turns to Ryan. "Ryan, please run down to the cafeteria and ask for a jar to keep it in until Ben puts it back where it belongs." "What do I do about the poop on my hands?" Frankie asks. Mrs. Tibbets gives him a dirty look, but Frankie doesn't seem to mind. Ben figures that Frankie's happy to have poop on his hands if only he can keep saying the word poop. "Ryan, go and please be quick about it. And Frankie, you may wash your hands." Ryan hops up out of his seat and bounces out the door, headed toward the cafeteria. Frankie leaves behind him. Ben sits at his seat, more confused than ever. He's waiting for Mrs. Tibbets to yell at him, but she just goes back to the front of the class. I mean, he's relieved, for sure, but also baffled. After what Miss Tibbets said, he's worried that he might have done something to hurt the frog. Mrs. Tibbets is standing in front of the classroom, trying to decide where to put the frog, when Mr. Nickleby, the principal, pushes Ryan through the door. "Excuse me, Mrs. Tibbets, is this one of your students?" the principal asks stiffly. Everything about Mr. Nickleby is official, even his voice. He's always dressed very neatly in a suit and a tie like a businessman. Ben's only talked to him once, the day that he enrolled in school last month, but he knows it's Mr. Nickleby's first year as principal, and he looks young. Tons younger than Mrs. Tibbets, but still, he's Mrs. Tibbets' boss, which seems completely weird to Ben. Everyone in the room but the principal knows that Mrs. Tibbets is still holding the frog. The whole class is holding its breath. Mrs. Tibbets sighs. "Yes, Mr. Nickleby, this is one of my students. This young man was running down the hall, and when I told him there was no reason to run, he explained that you had sent him on an emergency errand to the cafeteria." The class looks at Mrs. Tibbets. She's holding the frog right out in plain sight. "I did send him on an important errand, and I asked him to hurry. We need something for this." And she thrusts the frog out toward him like it's the most natural thing in the world to present a principal. Mr. Nickleby steps back. "Ah, a toad," he says in his official principal voice. "A frog," 4 or 5 students say all together, which doesn't help matters. Mr. Nickleby looks at the class like they're from Mars, and Mrs. Tibbets tries not to smile. "Yes, Mr. Nickleby," she says, "my frog. It needs a home for the rest of the day before it goes back to where it belongs." "Are you studying amphibians?" Mr. Nickleby asks. "Well, not exactly. We're studying the water cycle according to the curriculum. But it's early spring and frogs are around, and I really like them, so we're talking about frogs today." Mr. Nickleby frowns. Mrs. Tibbets and the principal stand 5 feet apart, staring at each other. Finally, Mr. Nickleby shakes his head and turns to Ryan. "Young man, absolutely no running in the halls, even when Mrs. Tibbets sends you on an errand." But she told me to hurry," Ryan begins. "No running, period." Mr. Nickleby gives Mrs. Tibbets one more hard look and heads out the door. The class is silent, watching Mrs. Tibbets. She shakes her head. Ben has a lump in his throat. Mrs. Tibbets could have told Mr. Nickleby that he snuck the frog into class, but she didn't. "Ryan," she said, "do you think you could please walk to the cafeteria and ask for a jar without getting any of us in more trouble?" "Sure, yeah," he says and bounds out the door. "No running!" Mrs. Tibbets yells after him as she heads back to her desk. She stops for a moment like she's thinking, and then she opens the top drawer, puts the frog in it, and shuts it. "On with the water cycle," she says, turning toward the board. Everyone smiles. It's great to be in science class with a frog in the drawer. Ben's not sure exactly what just happened between Mrs. Tibbets and Mr. Nickleby, but he doesn't seem like they like each other very much? Did he get Mrs. Tibbets in trouble? His knee jiggles up and down as he thinks about it, and he presses his hand against his stomach, which is turning over and over like it has a life of its own. He feels horrible and excited at the same time. There's something very unusual about Mrs. Tibbets. Something he really likes. At the end of the day, while everyone's ready to go home, Ben asked Mrs. Kutcher for permission to go back to the science room. He hopes Mrs. Tibbets is there. He wants the frog back. Mrs. Tibbets is standing at her desk. The frog is in a glass jar in front of her. Something feels sort of sad about Mrs. Tibbets. All alone in the room with the frog, Ben takes a deep breath and then lets it all out at once. Mrs. Tibbets? She looks up. Yes, Ben, do you have a question about homework? It's about the frog. He waits a moment for her to say something, and when she doesn't, he goes on. I'm sorry I brought it in, and I shouldn't have had it out in class. Ryan wanted to see it, and it got away. Mrs. Tibbets looks at him and then at the frog in the jar. Where did you find it? She asks. Out behind my house. In your backyard? Not exactly. Ben hesitates, and then the words just pour out of him in a rush. Well, first I heard this chirping noise, and when I followed it, I came to this place where it's really, really wet, and there were a lot of puddles and a bunch of trees standing in the water. And then I heard the chirps again, and I guessed it were frogs or maybe toads. Those were frogs, spring peepers. How do you know? Ben asks. I can't be sure without hearing them myself, but from the way you describe the place and the sound, I'd have to say that it be peepers. I often go out to listen to them in the spring. I love being outdoors. Me too. My husband taught science too, biology. He was the one who really loved frogs. I like frogs, Ben said. And lizards? At home in Tucson, I had a terrarium with a gecko in it. Tucson? Is that where you moved from? Ben nods. There was a wash near my house where the river ran when it rained, and I found all sorts of great stuff there. Sometimes I went with my friend Toby. I bet you miss it. Yeah, I do. It's different here. Ben has already said more than he imagined that he would. Mrs. Tibbets is the first person in Massachusetts who seems to have noticed anything about him. He likes Mrs. Kutcher all right, but she's never asked him about where he lived or what he likes. Mrs. Tibbets picks up the jar and holds it out. Well, Ben, I imagine that this frog feels the same way that you do about missing her home. Why don't you take her and put her back where she belongs? Ben smiles. Okay, I will. Sorry. That's all right. But no more frogs in school? Okay, Ben says. Unless I ask for them, of course. Mrs. Tibbets gives him a little wink. Ben takes the jar. He's almost out the classroom door when Mrs. Tibbets calls out, Oh, Ben! He stops and turns back. Mrs. Tibbets hesitates for a moment and then she says, The young man who used to help me around the yard has taken a full-time job at the landscape center, and I have a big place and I can't take care of it all by myself. Would you like to help me some Saturday? I have some nice woods and a pond on my land, And when we get through working, maybe we could take a walk and see what kinds of critters we find there. The word critters jumps out at Ben like an old friend. It's a word Mr. Tompkins always used. But Ben has never been to a teacher's house before. The whole thing seems a little strange. Sure, he said. Fine. Some Saturday then, whenever it stops raining. Okay, Ben says, and he hurries down the hall, carrying the glass jar with the toad inside. He doesn't want to miss the bus. He's got a frog to deliver. All right, more adventures in science class today. I hope you enjoyed chapter 4, and I look forward to reading through chapter 5 and reading more in our story together. I can't wait to find out what Ben does with Mrs. Tibbets at her house. I wonder what kind of creatures and things that they find. We'll just have to read some more next time. Bye.